I pushed open the bathroom door, expecting to grab a fresh towel from the closet. Steam billowed out, wrapping around me thick and warm. And then I froze. He stood there, back turned, a towel slung low around his waist, water still dripping from his hair. My breath hitched, but I couldn't look away fast enough. My brain screamed at me to turn to leave, but my body refused. His reflection in the mirror caught mine, and for a split second our eyes met. A moment too long. Too charged. His lips quirked at the corner like he knew I was still standing there. My face burned as I yanked my gaze away, mumbling an apology before practically running out. My pulse hammered in my ears. It was nothing. Just an accident. But as I moved through the house, pretending everything was normal, I felt it. His presence lingering in my mind. Later that day I caught him watching me. Not in a casual passing way. His gaze was steady, deliberate, unreadable. He didn't look away, didn't pretend he wasn't staring. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to keep my expression blank. At dinner, my husband barely spoke, buried in his phone as usual. But when he finally glanced up, his nephew grinned at him, then turned to me. So, do all the women in this house have a habit of walking in unannounced, or am I just special? My husband chuckled, not even looking at me. But the nephew held my gaze a second too long. My fingers tightened around my fork. I should have laughed it off. Instead, I felt something shift. Something dangerous. The next morning I told myself it was nothing. A moment. A slip. I went about my day as if nothing had changed, but something had. He moved through the house easily, relaxed, as if that charged second in the bathroom never happened. But when I caught his eye, there was something else there. A flicker of knowing, a quiet amusement, like he was waiting for me to react. I didn't. I wouldn't. My husband came home late again, barely acknowledging me as he set his briefcase down, muttering about meetings. Dinner was silent. Just the sound of silverware clinking against plates. No conversation, no warmth. A routine we both accepted. But then his nephew leaned back in his chair, stretching, his gaze flicking to me with something unreadable. You always eat this quiet? His voice was light, teasing, but his eyes held something else. My husband barely reacted, just scrolled through his phone. I forced a small smile. Some nights are like that. He nodded slowly, like he understood something I wasn't saying. I looked away, pretending I didn't feel the shift between us. Pretending I didn't notice at all. The house was quiet. Too quiet. My husband had left early for a work trip, his absence barely acknowledged. I was alone, or at least I thought I was, until I found him in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, stirring his coffee like he had nowhere else to be. I hesitated, but he looked up, smirking like he knew something I didn't. Do you ever get tired of it? His voice was casual, but there was an edge beneath it. I frowned. Tired of what? He shrugged, setting his mug down. Of pretending. Of living in a house that feels like a museum. My throat tightened, but I forced a laugh. That's life. Marriage isn't always exciting. He tilted his head, watching me too closely. So why stay? The words hung between us, heavy, dangerous. I turned to leave, but suddenly he was there, too close, his breath warm against my skin. My pulse skidded, but before I could step back, his lips brushed mine, brief, electric, inevitable. I gasped, jerking away, heart pounding. I fled, but later, staring at my reflection, my cheeks still burned. It wasn't just the kiss. It was that I didn't stop it. I avoided him. It was the only choice. I filled my day with meaningless tasks. Laundry, errands, anything to keep myself busy. But avoidance didn't erase what had happened. If anything, it made it worse. Every time I entered a room, I felt him before I saw him, a presence I was too aware of. He acted normal, like nothing had shifted, like his lips hadn't just brushed mine days ago. But I knew better. The way he lingered in doorways, the way his eyes found mine and held just a second too long. It wasn't innocent. It wasn't imagined. And yet we played the game, silent, careful, pretending nothing had changed. My husband was oblivious, buried in work, barely glancing up from his emails. He kissed my cheek out of habit, murmured something about a deadline, and that was it. No questions. No suspicion. No idea that the space between me and his nephew had become something unspoken, something alive. At dinner, I felt his gaze on me, waiting, daring me to acknowledge it. I didn't. But I wanted to. And that terrified me more than anything. I needed to fix this. To remind myself where I belonged. That night, as my husband sat at his desk, eyes glued to his laptop, I walked up behind him, resting my hands on his shoulders. He barely reacted, just let out a tired sigh. "Long day?" I asked softly, leaning in. He nodded, still typing. I hesitated, then pressed my lips to his cheek, lingering just a little longer than usual before tilting his face toward mine for a real kiss. His lips were there, but that was all. No warmth, no response, just a perfunctory press before he pulled away. "I've got a deadline," he murmured, already turning back to the screen. I swallowed hard, stepping back, the weight of his indifference sinking deep. How long had it been like this? How long had I been pretending it was enough? Later, in the dim light of the kitchen, I reached for a glass of water, but he was already there, watching, waiting. "Trouble sleeping?" His voice was low, knowing. My fingers tightened around the glass. I should have walked away. Instead, I met his eyes and felt the ground shift beneath me. The house was still. My husband had gone to bed early, exhausted, buried in another deadline. I stayed downstairs, pretending to read, pretending I wasn't waiting to be alone. But I wasn't alone. He walked in casual, like he wasn't supposed to be there, like he hadn't been watching me from the doorway. I didn't move. Neither did he. The air between us thickened. He leaned against the counter, reaching for a glass, and I did the same. Our fingers brushed. Light, accidental, meaningless. But neither of us pulled away. My pulse spiked. A long, charged silence stretched, then he exhaled, tilting his head slightly. "We both know this isn't just a coincidence." His voice was low, deliberate, daring me to argue. My breath hitched, but I forced a quiet laugh. "You're imagining things." He smirked, but it wasn't amusement. It was knowing. A challenge. The tension crackled, unspoken but undeniable. I stepped back, breaking the moment, but my hands still tingled where they'd touched. I told myself it was nothing. That I wasn't standing there waiting, hoping for him to prove me wrong. It was supposed to be nothing. A quick trip to the store, a breath of fresh air. But he was there, walking beside me, close enough that our arms nearly brushed. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. I told myself we were just two people running an errand. But then he leaned in, his voice low, amused. "People might start talking." I glanced up sharply, but before I could respond, I heard my name. I turned, heart lurching. It was her, my neighbor. She stood on her porch, watching, a slow, knowing smile creeping onto her face. "Didn't expect to see you two out together," she mused, voice light, but something flickered in her gaze. My throat tightened. "Just picking up a few things," I said quickly, forcing a laugh. She tilted her head. "You sure no one else noticed?" My stomach dropped. That night, as I lay in bed, my husband sleeping soundly beside me, I stared at the ceiling, pulse racing. This wasn't control. This wasn't safe. I had let something begin that I wasn't sure I could stop. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that only existed late at night. I shouldn't have been there. I knew that. But my feet carried me forward, my breath uneven as I hesitated in the doorway of his room. He stood near the window, his back to me, the glow of the streetlights casting long shadows across his face. He turned slowly, his expression unreadable, but there was no mistaking the tension crackling between us. My pulse pounded in my ears. I told myself to leave, to step away, to pretend this moment wasn't happening. But neither of us moved. The space between us was too small, too charged. His eyes flickered over me, waiting, daring me to acknowledge the shift that had been building for weeks. And then the door creaked open. My stomach dropped. My husband stood there, his gaze sweeping over the scene before settling on me. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The weight of his silence was heavier than any words could have been. I felt my chest tighten, the realization crashing over me. There was no way to explain this. No way to undo it. The silence in the house was suffocating. My husband barely spoke, barely looked at me, but his presence felt heavier than ever. He moved through the rooms like a shadow, his usual routine unchanged, yet everything about him was different. At dinner, he sat across from me, eating slowly, his eyes distant, unreadable. The weight of what had happened pressed against my chest, but I forced myself to act normal, to pretend. But he knew. I could feel it. The way his fingers drummed against the table, the way his gaze lingered just a second too long before flicking away. And then as I cleared the dishes, his voice cut through the silence, low, controlled. "You think I don't see it?" My hands trembled, the plate nearly slipping from my grasp. My pulse pounded in my ears, but I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I opened my mouth to deny it, to reach for some excuse, but nothing came. Because he wasn't asking a question. He was telling me he knew. And in that moment I realized there was no way out. No more pretending. No more lies. The house felt emptier than ever. I woke up to silence, an unfamiliar kind, the kind that settled into walls and refused to leave. His things were gone. No note, no goodbye, just absence. The car was missing from the driveway, his door left slightly ajar as if he'd left in a hurry. I stood there, staring, waiting for something, an explanation, a sign that this wasn't real. But reality had a cruel way of making itself known. By the afternoon my husband came home early. A suitcase by the door. His voice was calm, steady, practiced. I can't do this anymore. I wanted to fight, to plead, to convince him that we could fix it, but the words never came. He didn't argue. He didn't yell. He just left. And I let him. When the door clicked shut, I walked upstairs step by step until I faced my reflection in the mirror. My face looked the same, but I wasn't. I had nothing left. No husband, no nephew, no excuse. Just silence. Just consequences. Just the weight of knowing I had destroyed everything.